Ladies and gentlemen, let's start this meeting. It's 9:30 and the Seminole County Board of County Commissioners meeting will be called to order. We will allow public participation, as always, in both person and temporarily by using a virtual communications media technology. This meeting may be viewed on SGTV channel, on YouTube, and by registering to participate in the Zoom webinar. Interested parties may register in advance of the Board of County Commissioners meeting by registering on the Board of County Commissioners webpage and scrolling down to the webinar registration link. After registering, parties will receive a confirmation email containing information regarding how to join the webinar. If you are unable to join via computer or online, interested parties should call 407-665-0808 for additional information on how to participate via telephone. Please silence all cell phone and electronic devices and adhere to the social distancing and face covering requirements. This morning's work session will continue with proposed updates to the Land Development Code. Eliza Harris Giuliano, thank you, of Canaan Associates and staff will present. The work session today will be reviewing the Land Development Code revisions relating to the Florida-friendly planning design, I-4 signage overlay, assembly use standards, recreational vehicle parking, and other issues. So, Ms. Hammock, I'm going to let you begin the meeting. You are recognized.
Good morning, Chairman and Commissioners. For the record, Rebecca Hammock, Development Services Director. This morning, as you stated, we'll be going over some items for the Land Development Code update. We are going to start with our consultant, Eliza Giuliano Harris is going to start, and then we also have Greg Witherspoon here with us, who is also going to present. And then following their presentation, staff has a couple of brief items to go over regarding residential parking. Thank you.
Eliza, you are recognized.
Hi, good morning. I'm Eliza Harris Giuliano, and I'm the Director of Urbanism at Canaan Associates. We've been doing this for a little while now. Apologies, our slide set is not up quite yet, but okay, there we go. So, do you mind if we take the? Thank you. So this is work session number 7, so you probably recognize me by now. So I'm just here to do the overview of the process to start us off. So we've spent the first phase of this project reviewing current regulations, the second phase making very broad recommendations, and then now we're in the realm of specific recommendations for your review and the public's input. And then finally, we will be producing a full document with code, a code language level adoption document. And so we're not there yet, but we are at a level of fairly specific recommendations for your review. We're going to be talking about 4 items today that the chairman generally did an overview of: Florida-friendly plantings, I-4 signage overlay, the residential neighborhood pattern, which you've heard previously, but we're going to be doing an update of that. And then the assembly use standards is also an update. I'm going to hand it over to our lead landscape architect at Canaan Associates, Greg Witherspoon, to talk about the first 2 items, and then you'll see me again for the last 2 items.
Good morning, Chairman. Good morning, Commissioners. It's great to be back again. This is very different than the Arbor Ordinance, which we discussed at length before. We were asked to take a look at Florida-friendly landscapes and how we might better the current Land Development Code to align with Florida-friendly landscapes. The program itself has been around for a while, and we're going to talk a little bit about exactly what it is. We're going to talk about what are the tools that it provides. We're going to talk about what's next for the Florida-friendly program as well, because it is constantly evolving. There's a lot of people working on it and coming up with new tools and new, not regulations, but new guidelines regularly. And then we'll get into how does the current Land Development Code address the goals of the program, because there is some really good information in the current code. And then we'll talk about how we might further align the current Land Development Code with the Florida-friendly landscaping program. So the Florida-friendly landscaping program basically started out of a necessity to protect water quality and water conservation. And so in 2009, there's a state statute that actually says Florida-friendly landscaping is essential to that effort. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see all the different state organizations that came together to work on this program. They continue to work on this program. And it's important to note that local governments cannot prevent property owners from employing Florida-friendly landscape themselves. So if somebody in an HOA-run community wants to install a Florida-friendly landscape, the HOA cannot prevent them from doing that. It's led by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection and the University of Florida. And as I mentioned, there's a wide-ranging support from multiple organizations, both professional, educational, and governmental. So what is it? It's based on 9 principles. And the documents that are created are basically the best management practices in this arena of landscaping circulating around these 9 principles. Everything from using mulch appropriately to protecting the waterfront, and then some aspirational goals of attracting wildlife, using fertilizer appropriately and things of that nature. But really the big one is water efficiency, and then planting the right plant in the right place. I thought this was kind of fun. I attended the plant show this spring or this fall, and found out that there's actually a TV show out there. I didn't know, but it's a great way to learn a little bit more, and actually kind of a fun way to figure out how to transform your yard into a Florida-friendly yard. So it's a fun way. It's streaming at discoverfloridachannel.com. Flip My Florida Yard is the website if you're interested, and they do already have something like 12 episodes up there that you can download and take a look at.
And Chad Crawford is from Sanford.
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh,
And he
okay.
also is, and lives here still, and he is also putting out another program concerning water resources and everything he's working on right now.
Fantastic. That's great. I didn't realize there was that connection. That's great. So the tools that are out there. The first place to start is really the IFAS website. You can find everything that you need there, both digitally, and it will link you to other resources. But there's also the county extension offices that are statewide. The one here in Seminole, I believe, is on the campus of the Seminole State College. No, Seminole, oh, I'm getting that wrong. I apologize.
5 points.
5 points. Okay. Google put me in the wrong direction there. I apologize for that.
They're neighbors, it's close.
Okay, so at any rate, the resources that are available out there are amazing. And some of the documents that they have, you can see on the screen there to the right. I think it's interesting to note that they actually came up with model language for a Florida-friendly ordinance. And you can take a look at that. First one was done in 2003. They updated in 2009. Some municipalities have adopted it in full, but it's not intended to just be a blanket ordinance. It's really intended to be a tool for the local jurisdiction to tweak and manage the way that they want to use it. There's also the model ordinance for fertilizer use, and I think that's kind of important to note because many, many jurisdictions actually reference that document in their codes in some location. And in fact, the Seminole Code does the same thing. I believe it's in Part 12, I want to say, in terms of fertilizer use. They specifically mention Florida-friendly and how to use fertilizers. And then there's also, there's a tool, there's a covenants, conditions, and restrictions. So for HOAs, it's a really good tool to figure out how to incorporate some of the Florida-friendly landscaping principles in their documents. And then there's the Florida Yards and Neighborhoods Handbook. So this is a really, really good handbook. This goes in depth into all the different 9 principles, a full series of best practices. It's just a really good tool. And then one that some people are familiar with is the Guide to Plant Selection and Landscape Design. So there's two pieces to this document. The first one is landscape design. As a landscape architect, I appreciate them getting these images and these principles out there in terms of how to design your yard, which is great. But the real meat of that document is in the plant selection. It's a very, very good plant list for Florida. It is very comprehensive in terms of talking about water, soil, climate zone, adaptability, native, attracting plants, or attracting wildlife, whether it's birds or butterflies. If you haven't taken a look at that list, I would encourage you to do so. It's important also that they update it regularly. So if you went to one of your county extension offices today and picked up that book that I have right there shown on the screen, you'll find that there's actually stickers in there that say this plant is no longer considered Florida friendly, it's considered invasive. So the point there is that it's updated regularly, which I think is an important component of that tool. What's next? So currently, the Florida statute has said that the Water Management District shall work with to develop landscape irrigation and Florida-friendly landscape design standards for new construction. So that is underway, and it is based in coordination with the Florida Building Code, the Plumbing Volume Appendix F, turf and landscape irrigation systems. And the idea is that it's incorporating best practices from a number of programs throughout the state, whether it's Florida Water Star or the Green Industries or the other one that it says there, the specifications for turf and landscape irrigation systems from the Florida Irrigation Society. So all of this information that's flowing around out there has been incorporated into the completed draft, which is currently circulating for review. It's intended to be a tool that local governments can use. It's not intended to completely, it's not interchangeable, but there are elements of that can be incorporated into your current code in coordination with the Florida Building Code as well. It's important to note that it's mandating what they say no more than 60% sprinkler irrigation of the total irrigable area. The idea there is that sprinklers is kind of code for lawn and turf, right? And in your code right now, you can see a list up there of all these, a survey that they have done of all the different organizations that have some type of restriction on turf area. And your code is actually more restrictive than what is currently listed in this new draft document. Yours is at 40% versus 60%. Which gets us directly to what is currently in your land development code. Water efficient landscaping is literally the title of one of the sections of the code, and it's required for all common area open spaces and buffers. Several of the water efficient landscaping principles mirror specifically the principles of Florida friendly landscaping design. And what I find really interesting is plant selection and location. So the Seminole County Code has a Seminole-specific plant list, and it has identified water zone. So somebody has gone through and taken the time to look at all these various plants and attribute a water use, low, medium, high, requirement to each one of these plants. And that's important because that's the way the code has determined percentage of use as well as grouping in the design of the irrigation system. It's a fairly common thing that you see in many codes. However, the fact that Seminole has taken the time to actually create their own code is a pretty big deal. And it's fairly comprehensive. It's actually a little bit more wide open than the Florida-friendly design one is, so that's something to consider. And then native plants are mentioned in the water-efficient landscaping section. They do talk about every reasonable effort to preserve existing trees and native vegetation. And they also talk about using native plants to the maximum extent possible. That's a goal, obviously. It's hard to enforce, but it is language that hopefully folks are paying attention to. And then the irrigation system design requirements. Rain sensors are required, water use zone information is required, things of that nature. And so there is some very good information in the current code under the water efficient landscaping section. Potential updates to the code, one thing to consider is directly referencing the Florida Friendly Program. It's not directly referenced in this section. I think that adds a little bit of weight, and it gives, people who are doing their own houses, or maybe it's a new landscape architect to the state of Florida, it points them directly to the resources that could help them design a better landscape. We should probably clarify the high water use restrictions. There are places, of course, that require more than 40%, whether that's a park or a ball field or something of that nature. It's a typical kind of caveat that you find in other jurisdictions. And in terms of irrigation, the new design standards, I would recommend that the county take a look at that. There's some additional information in there beyond the sprinkler quote, if you will, requiring check valves where appropriate, requiring pressure regulators, and requiring smart irrigation controllers. All of these items are new, not new, but all of these items contributed to a more efficient use of water in the landscape, and they continue to do so. I would also look to the county to encourage other jurisdictions to incorporate some of these design standards. I think that's happening across the entire state. And then in terms of the plant list, I would reference, you also have a plant list that's a prohibited plant list in the code. I think I would change that and reference the state lists for prohibited and controlled species. Again, that's a tool that the state has developed, and it also is constantly updated and reviewed on an academic level, and it seems pretty simple to let them take the charge on that. And then consider the Florida Friendly Plant List. The caveat there is that you do need to come up with some language that correlates the water use. The Florida Friendly Plant List talks about water and soil conditions that are appropriate for a particular plant, but it doesn't talk about water use. So it's not talking about how much water needs to be given to a particular type of plant. Other jurisdictions come up with a correlation language that ties those two together, and that's a fairly simple thing to do if you decide you want to use the Florida Friendly Plant List. And then lastly, there's always opportunities for training. Use your county extension office, find those programs, encourage staff to get training, encourage whoever is working in the county to get training. It's really, really valuable, and the more we get people to understand that water is a precious resource, the better off we are all going to be in terms of our landscape. So with that said, I guess I'm happy to answer any couple of questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes, Commissioner Lockhart, then Commissioner Delory.
In all of these recommendations, are you suggesting that they be applied to individual lots, homeowner lots, or is this to the overall open space, common spaces of development?
Just the common area open spaces and the buffers.
Thank you.
Commissioner Delory?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate your presentation. In a couple of your statements, you talked about how either Florida-friendly planting or the fertilizer ordinance should be tweaked, that this is just a guide. How would you tweak it?
Two different things there. So the Florida Friendly Fertilizer is a separate document that I don't believe needs to be tweaked. The guide on the Florida Friendly Irrigation is where they recommend the 60%, and for instance, this is just one example, if you will, but they have the recommendation of the 60%. Your code already has 40%. I would stick to the 40%. So that's one case where I wouldn't just fully adopt their code language. And then it's up to you to kind of look and see if you want to require things like check valves and smart irrigation sensors and things of that nature, because it does add cost to the irrigation system itself.
Actually, I've actually installed one of those smart irrigation.
Have you?
It's not difficult at all. And I was amazed at how reasonably priced it was.
And the technology is getting better and better every day, right? I mean, now you operate them off your telephone or your pad or whatever it may be. I'm working on I'm working on a really large community in Lake County, and it's going to be, built over 10 years. years, and each time we're adding another phase of irrigation system, and it's still operated all by that one little controller. It's
I was
great.
amazed at how it doesn't have a rain sensor. It uses local micro stations.
And that's another thing, and those are continuing to evolve, right? And so, you see language that it talks about the old school rain sensors where they're saying that, okay, you can't put that underneath an eave. Well, that's kind of a no-brainer, but nowadays the technology is getting so much better, not only in terms of the sensor capacity, but also how to install it and where to install it.
Correct.
And as I think that what you were saying also is, it was reasonably priced, and therefore the return on investment, because saving of the water and the cost of the water, it returned back. You said there was costs, but those costs are
Yes.
easily recovered because of the cost.
So the other question I
Saving the
have is
water.
that when you look at the high volume percentage, right now at 40%, I see Oviedo is at 30%, is what I saw. What's the right number?
Oh, that's a tough one. I like your 40%. I like your 40%, I do. I think 60% is a little bit onerous. I actually, I work with a irrigation specialist regularly here in Central Florida. He's completely against any of those mandates, to be honest with you, in terms of the percentage, but I think 40% is a good number. And I think if you look at contemporary landscape design nowadays, using lawn and using turf appropriately, 40% it's a good number. And it's a strict number too, by the way. It's not 60%. It's strict.
I think it's important that we actually ask you, an expert like yourself, what that right number is, so thank you.
Yeah.
Commissioner?
The reason why I said that is each of these jurisdictions have chosen their number because they think it's the right number for them. And so to ask someone who may work for multiple of these jurisdictions to decide which one's the right number might put him in over a barrel.
I did not take offense by that.
Okay, good. The term Florida friendly is a trademark term.
Correct.
And so when we use the phrase, we're in essence describing all of the 9 principles. And so I would hope that as we move forward, and certainly I have no opposition to Florida friendly landscaping, I think it's wonderful, but when we use the phrase, I think it's important that we make clear that it is a trademark term.
Absolutely.
And it has meaning, and that we're not mandating that someone implement all 9 principles, because then we get into we've talked about this before with staff, is how do you measure compliance of 9 principles? So if there's a way that you can help us craft that language so that it sends the message that we want to send and encourages compliance to the best capability, but doesn't necessarily pin people into a place where compliance is virtually impossible.
And that makes sense. If you look at the way different jurisdictions are doing this, and in fact, even in your code, right, it starts off with the principles, the water efficient principles. And so in a very similar way, we can reference the principles of the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program, but we're not going to send code enforcement people out there to measure your mulch and make sure you have 3 inches of mulch.
Awesome. Love it. Thank you.
Commissioner, did I see you have your
I
hand up?
did. In terms of feedback, there's, I think, 2 components to this that I thought were exceptionally wise advice, and I would really encourage us to take it, and that is removing the onerous task of us continually updating lists and using those agencies, including the state agencies. The one tweak that I would make to that is that any reference that we have should reference the current list. So at the time of development, they're using the most up-to-date guidelines. I quite frankly am perplexed to know how something can move from recommended to invasive, but that just is an indication of perhaps my lack of knowledge in this area, or theirs, I don't know which. And then the last one that I thought was really important is that we do need to invest in training, not only for our team, but for us. And as much of that as we can get into the public purview, that would be awesome, because we have discussions in this chamber where we're all using the same words and meaning different things. And it is, it's just not productive, and it actually doesn't create the right outcome. So the recommendation on training was spot on, and I appreciate everything you've done. It's great work.
Thank you, Commissioner. And that particular plant that I'm thinking of was a barberry, and I have no understanding of how they determined that it was all of a sudden, now it's not good. But it points to the fact that they are continually updating the list, which I applaud.
Educating themselves.
Well, and I
Yes.
would rather they do it than us pay to
Right.
do it on top of them paying to do it.
Right.
That makes no sense.
Right.
So the only questions I have are number one, well, before, I might have others, but right now, on your page 11, I believe, those list of those cities, counties that have the percentage of the irrigation, those are the only ones that have identified a percent in the whole state of Florida?
This was a survey provided to me by a great resource at one of the water districts, and I don't know the entire background. I can't say that this is a complete state survey, but it's certainly indicative of those that have decided to make this.
But for the reason, the purpose of, you said to encourage other jurisdictions, I don't know, and I don't know if anybody else knows of any other city in the county other than Oviedo that has this. The only reason I know Oviedo has it is because you listed it.
Right.
So I was wondering, that if this was the complete list. So as we might take your recommendation of encouraging other jurisdictions, I wanted to know what our other 6 cities might have in there. If you don't know, that's fine, we can find out.
I don't know, but we can certainly find out easily, yes.
The second thing is that the book that you suggested, and, kind of piggybacking on what Commissioner Herr had, if we could, not you, but if we could ask staff to get that book for all of us so that we have that, so we will have that as a reference, I think that would be good. You have one, but I don't know.
I have multiples, I'll share them.
Oh, okay, great. So there we go. We got that taken care of.
Check the box, move on.
Yep, let's move. Okay, so I counted 7 different recommendations that you made, and I just wanted to go through and see if, from a standpoint of this board, if we have any problems with me moving forward with any of them. One was that we change and we put references in into our codes. Does anybody have any problem with that? Okay, I see none, so we're going to move it. The second was something about high water use. What would...
So, again, you've got the 60% threshold, right? But if a park comes in, it's a standalone project, it's a shared open space, and it's a ball field, that's going to go beyond that 60%. And so we just need to clarify that there's some,
Does anybody have any problem with that? Okay. The third one was sprinklers, new items, more efficient to put them into the code. Does anybody have any problem with that? Okay. The other one's encouraging jurisdictions. I don't think anybody would have any problem with that. Another one was the state list is to flip it and use to use the state list, not our list, because it's constantly changing. Does anybody have any problem with that? Okay, the other one was the Florida-friendly plant list. Correlates with water use, I think. Does anybody need any explanation before we agree on that one or disagree? Anybody have any problem with that one? And the last one was training. Does anybody have any problem with that one? Did I cover everything that you...
You did. Yeah,
okay.
absolutely.
And as far as training goes, I think that that's just not only for us, but for all of our staff. So, Rebecca, do you have a guide now for what to do with the changes? Okay, does anybody have any additional discussion on that? Commissioner Lockhart?
Well, this is fantastic. This goes back to a conversation that we had during our budget discussion about investing more resources into our IFAS team that does the Florida Friendly program, and Rick Durr is here, and we have a tremendously talented, exceptional team of people already on our staff in our partnership with the University of Florida, who, if we commit to giving those resources through the county manager, through our budgeting process, to expand that and include more opportunities for citizen involvement, and they're trying to do as much as they can online right now, but just to even tell Rick to tell his people we love and appreciate them and we need them to continue to do what they're doing and expand, I think that would be a big running start from this board to give that direction to the county manager.
Okay, so we've all agreed with the recommendations, and Rebecca understands where we're going, and I hope the staff, or not only the staff, but the folks that are both listening as well as here, understand that we're taking the recommendations of our consultants. But before we go on to the next one, I want to see, is there anybody here, either virtually, James, or in the audience that wishes to speak on Florida-friendly landscaping?
We have a couple online, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. James, go ahead and send the first in and let me know who it is, please.
It's going to be Ms. Nancy Harmon.
Okay, Ms. Harmon? When she starts, yeah. Ms. Harmon?
She's muted.
Ms. Harmon, you're muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Ms. Harmon.
Okay, thank you. I had to shut my phone off my car. Okay, thank you very much, presenter. Nancy Harmon, 752 Pioneer Way, Geneva, Florida. I thought the presentation was very knowledgeable, had a very positive upbeat to it. I would like to request that in the area of training, that training isn't a may, but is a must for certain people on the staff, because I think for them it's to their advantage to have the opportunity for the training and to be updated on a regular basis as IFAS or someone of that nature would deem necessary. Because with those people having the knowledge, then I would ask that their knowledge be taken forward and that every development that is proposed and that during the development process of designs being reviewed from plats and all that good stuff that goes on, that they mandate, that we mandate in our code to see that plant list and where the plants are going at the time or prior to them being put in the ground, so that there's at least in the beginning a means to determine compliance. Granted, you can't do hardly anything afterwards because we don't have anybody hired to do that really. Our code enforcement, I don't think they have the skills. We could teach them, but when you have one person for one district or two persons for one district, it's a big job. So if we could do it in the beginning, I think it would be helpful. The other thing, Commissioner Lockhart's concerned about individual landholders. I still believe homeowners associations should be required to mandate in their designs and their maintenance that that Florida-friendly, whatever the term you want to use, but non-invasive and Florida natural plants be used. Reduce the landscaping from the standpoint of grass. If people want to mulch their whole yard and put in islands, they should be allowed to do that. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Harmon. Who else, James?
Gabrielle Milch.
Yes, Ms. Milch?
I'm bringing it in right now, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, James.
Technology at its finest. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm so happy to be here today. I'm very excited about what I'm seeing on the water efficient landscaping code and upgrading the Florida friendly. I was the agent there at the county for many years, and we always needed a boost in our popularity. We tried to do a lot of different things. So I'm very happy to see this in the land development code, and I know it'll help our water resources. It'll help a lot of different aspects of life in Seminole County and keep things good. And I appreciate It used to be just kind of a focus on stormwater runoff and non-point source pollution, and now I see that we're actually expanding into the water conservation areas, since, you know, we have our groundwater resources that could be considered to be a little endangered. And so I am very appreciative of the board's work, and it's been a long haul, and I'm sure it's going to be a long haul after that, getting contracts done to reduce irrigation and be more Florida friendly. And I just want to put a plug in there to WaterStar, to all the development community out there. If they could look into WaterStar, it's a voluntary program that's used by the St. Johns River Water Management District and all around the state. So thank you, Board of County Commissioners. I appreciate you greatly.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Appreciate it very much. Oh, Gabrielle, will you please give your name and address for the record?
Oh, sorry. Gabrielle Milch, 252 Coble Drive, Longwood, Florida. I'm in unincorporated Wekiva area, Hunt Club.
Thank you. I know you were so excited to tell us how wonderful this is. Appreciate that. Okay, anyone else? Seeing none, we're closing the public hearing on this issue. And Rebecca, just one thing. I think that on one comment about the training, when you bring this back, you might want to give us some recommendations, or you and the county manager, as to who should be required to take some training and who should, be encouraged to take it. I would appreciate that very much. With that, is there any other questions on this one? Okay, let's move on to the second one, I-4 corridor commercial signage. And Ms. Harmon, if you missed it, we just suggested to Rebecca to do one of your suggestions. Thank you very much. Yes, do we have the signage? Yes, there we go.
This signs. So this is going to be pretty short. We found, per staff's advice, that there was one area that we might consider tweaking in terms of the sign code, and that has specifically to do with height restrictions that are within the I-4 corridor. This came about because current code currently does not allow for tall pole signs. We've got pole signs that are allowed at a 15-foot maximum. And what's happened is at some key intersections, there's been redevelopment. And the redevelopment that's occurring just a little bit off of the intersection is basically they're looking to create a better advertisement presence. And in order to do so, they need a taller sign. That has to come back for a variance. And so the thought is maybe we can find a way in the code to allow for that without having to come back for a variance. And so we took a look. There's three main intersections where this could be applied. You can see the circle on these maps is actually a quarter-mile radius adjacent to the interchange. And then the colored parcels are the parcels that are in unincorporated Seminole County. After we did this analysis and we worked with staff, we don't think this is appropriate for Lake Mary Boulevard. However, the other two intersections, we should consider potentially allowing for taller signs, which we're recommending would be a maximum 40-foot height. And that's pretty much it. And so the idea there is that if those areas start to redevelop, I know in the bottom interchange there's a couple of restaurants that are certainly probably on the cusp of redevelopment potential, and this would allow the next developer or development to have a taller sign that can be seen from I-4.
Okay, questions? Yes, Commissioner?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My concern is sign pollution.
Yes.
And I haven't yet heard what the problem is that we need to address. We're saying that we'd like to address this, but I haven't really heard what the problem is yet. I can tell you that when I do drive around, you notice when there's a lot of signs, and it's nice when there's not a horrific amount of sign clutter. And a lot of roads are trying to unclutter themselves, and here we're going to be trying to increase clutter. And I haven't heard yet what the problem is.
My understanding of the problem is that there is opportunities, and this has come before, for redevelopment that are occurring. And the development that is happening would like to have a better advertisement presence so that they could be seen from I-4. And that's specifically the issue. They come in and they're requesting to have a taller sign that requires a variance. And we're looking at opportunities to allow that without having to have a variance to the code.
All right, so I'll go one step further, Mr. Chairman.
Sure.
So on I-4, you can see that the exits are not really at the intersections. They're
Correct.
a lot further away.
Correct.
So unless you know you're getting off, you're going to miss the exit. And I can give you 46 is a perfect example.
Yeah.
And I've gone to 792. I've even gone across
I love Volusia County.
Volusia County. I mean, it's a great place to turn around.
Yes.
But my point is that you can't have signs everywhere. And the best direction that I've seen people is, like we talked about with irrigation, is their smartphones.
Yeah.
And I've not yet really seen the issue that is telling me I need to change the sign ordinance. The commission earlier years have made a strong commitment to declutter with billboards, and that was a big issue for years.
Yes.
And I just want to make sure that that doesn't come back.
Yep.
Commissioner Hurd?
Well, you just caused me to reminisce about a time when I drove to Volusia County and I was heading here for a briefing with Carlton Henley, Commissioner Henley. And you talk about sweating bullets, it was not good. It's still seared into my memory. I agree with you on the notion that if you're going to put these signs right at the intersection, they've already missed the exit in most cases. And my concern is more for the community around these developments than for the ability for somebody to be 15 to 40 is a huge jump. And so the Lake Mary Boulevard one coming off of here, you're putting that sign right in the Heathrow corridor. There is no way that's conducive to what goes on around in that. But I struggle to see how it makes sense in the other areas as well. So I struggled with this one as well.
I think we're coming to a consensus that we need to leave that alone, and that if there is somebody that wants a bigger sign, they can ask for a variance and come back, and it might on a case-by-case basis. Does anybody object with us going with that direction and then moving on to the next one?
I would just like to get on the record that if this becomes the business of then we grant every variance, then that's also problematic. So I
Agreed.
think that's a healthy discussion to have of maybe 40 is not the right number. What is the number? And we don't do variances. I certainly, as the novice up here, am not professing to know the answer, but we can't be in the business of every variance that waltzes up here gets granted, or
Well-
the McDonald's gets one, but the other one doesn't.
In the 9 years I've been here, we've never had a variance on this that I can recall. So I don't think that we're going to start having a flood of them. However, I think that where we are right now might be a little better. Then I have Commissioner Lockhart and then Commissioner Delory.
Well, that was actually going to be my question, is to staff. How many requests for variances have we had for this issue in the last however long?
For the record, Rebecca Hammock, Development Services Director. This issue, I guess, was placed on our land development update list as something to discuss a while back when the State Road 46 corridor there was a lot of redevelopment with the hotels and the Wawa. And so currently there are some taller signs at the State Road 46 intersection, like McDonald's has a taller sign, and then one of the older hotels had a taller sign. So what they did is they actually kept their pole sign standing and then came in and asked for variance variances and were granted by the Board of Adjustment. But that seems to be the main intersection currently that has had that issue, but staff is fine with just leaving the code as is and addressing it. It hasn't come up since all that redevelopment has occurred, but that was the area that we were concerned about, and that's why that's why we wanted to look at it. But when we did start looking at it, we don't think Lake Mary Boulevard intersection is appropriate for this. We do have the Lake Mary Boulevard overlay standards, and the city of Lake Mary would probably not be supportive of that change either.
So any requests that came through for variances went to the Board of Adjustment, and they weren't necessarily challenged to be brought to
Exactly, they
BCC.
were not
Okay.
appealed.
So,
And
but
that area
sounds like
doesn't
fewer than 5.
Yeah, I think there were about 3.
Okay.
And there's no residential really in that area, so there was an opposition.
While you're up, I think we've settled on this one. While you're up, I did suggest to the commission, even though this is not on billboards, but Bob mentioned billboards, and I just wanted to say something. Did anybody, I asked Rebecca to look into, on the billboards, you see what Orange County was doing with the Arts Council, and they were actually doing a art design on billboards as far as the actual art show as it went down I-4. And I asked, since they were doing that in Orange County, why couldn't they continue it all the way in Seminole? So I asked, and I just wanted to let everybody know that the staff look into that and see if we could get with the Arts Council to see if they could expand it into Seminole, because I really feel that that's something that would be nice for our residents. Yes, I'm sorry.
Yes, I was just going to say, I am going to be looking into that. I don't have any information for you today, but.
Yes, I understand that. I just wanted my fellow commissioners to know that I asked the staff to do that, so if it came up, everybody would, that you all were requested to look into that. And I just think it would be, if we could do it, it would be kind of nice. And just what they're actually doing. Thank you very much. Let's move on to the next one, residential. Yes.
Just one comment on this, and then we can move on. The other thing, Mr. Chairman, is I-4 will be changing as we move on, called the Beyond the Ultimate.
Oh, yeah.
So exits may be moving. Not saying that's going to happen, and I don't want you to get ahead of that, so just pay attention to it. That's all.
Thank you. Okay, the next one is residential neighborhood pattern concepts.
Thank
Who's
you,
up
Mr.
for
Chairman.
this one?
Thank you, Commissioners. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Eliza. I appreciate it.
You've been very helpful today. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
And quick. We like that.
Good morning again.
Good morning.
Again, Eliza Harris Giuliano with Keenan Associates. So as I mentioned, this is an item that we've previously discussed, but we've made some, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the overall intent, and then I'm going to focus on the changes that have been made since you saw it last. So the concept of the residential neighborhood pattern is really to provide an alternative to the planned development path for specific types of residential projects that are single-family in nature, but want to achieve the densities that are permitted by the future land use district that they're in, and can't necessarily achieve those through the existing zones that are permitted in those future land use districts. That are permitted in the zoning districts. So typically, even the maximum zoning district within one of our future land use districts doesn't permit the density that is permitted in that district. So why would the county want to do this? Well, we're going to get into the standards a little bit more, but the standards require more and better quality open space. They require canopy trees, as well as dealing with the long-term maintenance issues associated with those. It provides predictability compared to today's route. So developers would still have the option of approaching this from a plan development standpoint, but the idea of this is that you have standards already in place that staff has agreed to, that the board has agreed to, so that you aren't reinventing the wheel each time folks come in, which takes staff time, takes board time, and is a cost to the developer, which he or she's typically going to pass on to the consumers. And we know affordable housing and attainable housing are issues in this region. One of the other benefits to the county that's been enhanced in this draft is connectivity of streets. James. Thank you. I talked a little bit about this already, but why do you need an alternative to the plan development path? And again, it's an alternative, it's not prohibiting that path. But it does take more of everyone's time to do a plan development, and it's an overly complex process as designed for what people are asking for, which is generally just lot sizes that are a little bit smaller. And it also doesn't guarantee that you'll get back a consistent result from those projects because, again, it has to be renegotiated every time. So in terms of revisions since the prior draft, we've enhanced the street connectivity requirements. We've changed the applicability. So we took out some of the largest lot size zones that were previously included in the draft, which are R1 quadruple A and R1 triple A. Those would no longer be eligible for this alternative route. We also added the medium-density residential future land use and a couple of zones associated with that, R1B and R1 double B. Again, this path is limited to single-family detached typologies. And in a different presentation, we're dealing with missing middle and other typologies besides single-family, but this is focused on single-family detached. We also added the requirement that the HOA maintain the street trees and sidewalks. We know that there sometimes is a concern from public works departments when requiring street trees that there'll be impacts on the sidewalks over time. Typically, it's a long time before the trees get big enough to have those impacts. So it makes sense that the people who are going to most closely benefit from those wonderful tree canopies also are the ones who are paying for the sidewalk maintenance associated with that. We also clarified that there's no additional waivers that are going to be permitted. If you decide to take this path, you have to take the whole package, and it's not that you get all the benefits and then get to waive some of the requirements. Talking a little bit more about connectivity, we described that street connectivity is required. Specifically, cul-de-sacs and hammerheads are prohibited in most conditions, with a few exceptions. One of the exceptions is to provide a future street connection. For instance, if there's a vacant tract next door, you want to make sure that there's an incentive to provide a connectivity to that in the future. Also to connect to trails. Sometimes you want to connect to, for instance, a bicycle trail, and you'd want to stop the road in order to allow that connection to happen. Or you want to put a road in a direction where there's not an opportunity for a roadway connectivity. I always seem to need water when I'm up here, don't I?
Yes.
Does someone have an extra bottle of water?
Mr. Chairman, can we take a 5-minute recess?
Sure. 5-minute recess.
Just make it a little bit easier.
Okay. James will catch up. So let's call the meeting to order, and go ahead, Liza.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I should also note that for both of these presentations, there is a more detailed memo in your packet that provides additional background as well as more detail on the standards that are proposed for each of these sections. Can I get the slide deck back up?
Not till James comes back.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, James. We woke James up. Thank you, James.
I do have a copy I can...
No, it's up
I can
again.
use
It's up again.
reference. Okay. So as you mentioned, there are exceptions to the prohibition on cul-de-sacs. I mentioned two of them. The third is that if there's a reasonable expectation that there's a need for a cul-de-sac, such as a water body, I think there's a little bit of an echo.
Okay, Nancy.
She's really committed to listening to the session.
She really is.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
So if there is a need to put in a cul-de-sac, for such as if you want to connect to a water body where clearly the road is not going to connect, there is an option to install a close, which is essentially a more attractive, and it's what you see in the image on the left there, a more attractive form of cul-de-sac that has some landscaping in the center. Does add a little bit of cost, but frankly, we want to prohibit developers from doing these, so a little bit of extra cost isn't necessarily a bad thing in this instance. In addition, there's the requirement to connect to existing roadways, of course, in the absence of access management requirements that would prohibit that. And I need to get my clicker back. Thank you. So this was an illustration that we did comparing the conventional zoning to the RNP, just to give a sense of how much the improvements would be to the open space, to the access to stormwater, as well as with the addition of required street trees. For those who are more table-oriented, this is a comparison between the two. In the conventional zoning districts, street trees are not required. They are required in RNP. Conventional residential zoning districts are exempt from open space requirements, but it is required in RNP, and it's required to be a usable open space like a park or an extension of the area around a stormwater area to make it a park-like environment. Stormwater ponds are not required to be amenitized in the conventional zoning, but they are required in the RNP, which means that people can access them as a pond or a lake for both visual and to walk by, rather than being behind a fence or something like that. basic street connectivity is required in conventional zoning just to allow fire access, but more street connectivity is required in the RNP with the prohibition of cul-de-sacs and specific requirements to connect to neighboring properties. And finally, housing orientation. The RNP includes requirements that discourage garage-forward design of homes by requiring that any home that is on a lot less than 50 feet wide would be required to be rear-loaded, and that garages have to be essentially behind the front door of a house, rather than the garage being in front of the front door of the house, which is a very kind of basic version of the design, a more robust design requirement we might do for a private developer or for a form-based code. So in summary, we believe this creates a win-win for the county and for the people coming in building new housing and the people that are going to live in those neighborhoods. It permits new flexibility of lot dimensions and setbacks and trades off those smaller lots for a better quality of life with common open space, amenitized ponds, and street trees. And I will go back to that slide. I'm happy to take any questions on this item.
I would like to take questions on this. I do have one public comment and everything, so I want us, let's go to public comment. Ms. Harmon, you believe that you're up here for public comment, and then we're going to go into questions and discussion by the commission. And James, do you have anybody in virtual?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so we'll do that next, so get them prepared, James. Thank you. Yes, Ms. Harmon.
Nancy Harmon, 752 Pioneer Way, Geneva, Florida. I believe this section needs to be looked at again. I don't see any addition to this other than adding trees. Every development still has stormwater management, and while it was stated stormwater management does not have to have an amenity, previous BCC stormwater systems have been deemed with an amenity because they had grass. Grass is a requirement when you put in a stormwater system, period, because it's under the borough pits. So this idea that grass is an amenity, which is probably exactly what we're seeing here to some respect, is a picnic table and a bunch of grass, that's not an amenity. A stormwater management system is not an amenity. It is a requirement to maintain storm water when there's flooding or when there's runoff, period. You can't walk in it, you can't swim in it, you can't ski in it, you can't play in it. It's nasty water when the water's there. It's dangerous, particularly in the summertime when we have these amoebas floating all around. It says it won't be fenced. What's protect the families and the kids from not getting in the water and getting in? It's crazy to call a stormwater management system an amenity. I'm sorry. It's part of the development. As far as amenities go and the open space requirement, I don't know in conventional, but I know in other developments, open space is required. We were just here with Sylvan Estates and had a big discussion about that. It is a requirement. And 8% to me is ridiculous. I mean, it's just, we need to have some reasonableness here. Help the developers, yeah. If they want to have little scrunchy developments with little houses right next door to each other, build townhouses, build condominiums. But don't say they're single-family homes and you have these wonderful amenities with a stormwater management system. I'm sorry. I think it needs work. Trees, so they're going to plant trees on the sidewalks. Homeowners associations are going to cut the trees down because they're breaking up the sidewalks. And I know we've had all these things about there'll be the dimension around the trees and all that. 20 years from now, please, sidewalks degrade, it creates a problem. I am all about getting away from PDs. I'm all about getting away from that argument. I'm all about getting away from that waste of your time and our time. I just don't think this is the answer. This is just a plat laid out with some new cartoon characters on it to represent a better option. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. James, who do you have, and anyone else here in public right now? Seeing none. James, do you have any, who is in cyber?
Blaine Dara.
Lane Darrow. Please, come on in.
I think I'm here. I don't know how to get the video working, but can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Blaine Dara, 1624 Cherry Ridge Drive, Heathrow, Florida. I want to echo what was just said about the street line trees. We have learned a very serious problem here in Heathrow with oak trees put between the sidewalk and the street. We are spending thousands of dollars to repair sidewalks. We're now, after 20, 25 years of growth, spending thousands of dollars to repair streets. And the curbs along the streets, it's unbelievable. I looked during the Florida friendly plant discussion at large trees, and white oaks are included in there, or live oaks, excuse me. And I got to tell you, we were trying to do live oaks as replacement trees. They don't work. They are still, in just a few years, sending out their roots both toward the street, and in a small lot like you've got there, they will damage the foundations of the house. So even though it's in the Florida friendly list, I would strongly recommend that live oaks not be included in any development plan, especially the small kind of plan you have there. You need to somehow put in the instructions that is not a satisfactory solution. And I'm just giving you a warning from experience. It has been very expensive and very tough. And if you can put some small decorative trees along there, fine, but don't go for the large canopies. Any questions?
Thank you, Blaine. Appreciate it very much. Anyone else that we have in cyber? James?
No, sir.
Thank you very much. Eliza, I'm sorry. You've heard those concerns. Did you want to comment on those? And then I have Commissioner Delory that also has a question.
Yes, sir. So one specific change that was in the memo but was not in the slide deck relative to street trees is that we'd already required an 8-foot greenway in which to plant those trees, which is more generous than you'll see in a lot of existing developments. Of course, I'm not familiar with the specific development that was mentioned, but it may be less than 8 feet. However, in addition to that, in this draft, we've actually said that if you are less than 10 feet, that you have to provide a root barrier, which protects those sidewalks. And I'm not saying there will never be sidewalk maintenance. No matter what, there will be sidewalk maintenance, even if there are no trees. However, it will delay the need for sidewalk maintenance significantly for those 8-foot strips. And that provides an option for the person building it to either build an 8-foot strip with a root barrier or a 10-foot strip without the root barrier, providing a little bit more open space. There was a specific comment about stormwater ponds when there's different requirements about how you build stormwater ponds when they are unfenced. If they're fenced, they can, from an engineering standpoint, be built essentially as a concrete pit in which the water goes, whereas if they are unfenced, you're required to have a low slope into those stormwater ponds mainly to protect from any concerns about falling into the water unintentionally. Actually, as a kid, I remember going fishing in the stormwater pond in our neighborhood. I would not recommend eating those fish. I think it was about this big, but it was a fun family activity that I did as a kid a few times. So the main thing is that in a lot of conventional developments, those stormwater ponds are built in such a way that they would be similarly accessible, but they're privatized behind individual homeowners' backyards. So they're only accessible to a few members of the community. Whereas the requirement that at least half of the pond be open to the community makes that available to everyone in the community as opposed to just a small number of homeowners. But we also, with it being 50%, you're also allowed to have private frontages as well. So it spreads the benefit of those around, as well as prohibiting the concrete pit model, which typically doesn't happen in residential. That's something that you would see more in commercial or in very high density situations. I'd be happy to take any additional questions. I think the larger issue of whether or not this is a benefit relative to the existing types of development that are being approved as PDs is really a question for the commission, of course.
Commissioner Delory.
Thank you. What economic analysis have you researched or able to provide by removing cul-de-sacs? Because most people, when they buy into a subdivision, want to live on a cul-de-sac, and they're paying a premium to live on the cul-de-sac.
So cul-de-sacs are, again, like the privatization of stormwater ponds, something that benefits a small number of members of the community at the expense of the community as a whole. So the lack of transportation connectivity then increases the amount of traffic that go in front of other people's homes that are in that community. So that's the trade-off that you get with cul-de-sacs.
Okay, but do you have any financial data that shows that?
Commissioner, I'm not sure that shows
In other words, if
what.
you're buying into a subdivision, and we're just going to theoretically say that there is a 10% increase on lots that are on a cul-de-sac, so you're losing the value of that increase of that home value of that, and I'm just assuming 10%. So if anyone looked at that,
We've not looked at the economic cost of prohibiting cul-de-sacs. The benefit is not an economic benefit, it's a transportation engineering benefit.
so next question I would have, because I think that is a concern, at least from my standpoint. The next concern I have is cut-through traffic now. Since we're talking about transportation, what analysis have you made that you're going to increase cut-through traffic now on side streets for cul-de-sacs without having the cul-de-sacs?
Sure. So the fact that you don't have a cul-de-sac does not necessarily mean, we do include requirements that you connect to existing roadways. That doesn't mean that every single street is going to connect to existing roadways. There are still three-way intersections that aren't necessarily through streets. I will say the fewer through streets you have, the greater the burden is on any street that is a through street. So what we generally recommend from a transportation planning standpoint is the more connectivity you can provide, the lesser burden there is on any particular part of the neighborhood.
I understand that, but I can refer to at least one subdivision that wants to come in, that wants to connect into an existing street that is a cul-de-sac, so you're actually increasing cut-through traffic on an existing community now. As you looked at that at all, and what those numbers pertain to?
So I understand there was a specific instance in which I think a community was only accessible through another community, which is a...
That is not true.
Okay, that's not the condition.
And they wanted to connecting into it. I'm not trying to get into a public hearing here. That's why I'm being very, not going to specifics. But by not allowing cul-de-sacs, now we're, in my mind, you're promoting cut-through traffic of existing neighborhoods. Have you looked at that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a trade-off that comes into play whenever you're talking about increasing connectivity. That now, to the extent that there's not, to the extent that most existing neighborhoods, unless they have specifically built a stub out, then there won't be an opportunity to connect to them. In most cases, there aren't those opportunities.
I'm going to respectfully disagree with you. Sure. Because I know of at least one neighborhood that could actually happen to, and that there's no stub out. If there was a stub out, that'd be different, but you can actually do exactly what you said that you can't do. I've seen it. I've seen the logic behind it.
From a community-wide transportation standpoint, it improves the overall connectivity of the community, but it does increase the impacts on a particular street, and that could be a case-by-case basis. The only requirement we have in the existing draft is to connect to existing stub-outs or vacant lots. We don't require connections through other unidentified areas of existing subdivisions.
Further, yes, Commissioner.
So I have a question about the removing R1 AAA and R1 quadruple A from the potential zoning areas. Is there a reason why we stopped at R1 AAA and didn't go all the way down to R1 AA?
We understood that the lot sizes that were permitted in R1 AAA and R1 quadruple A were quite different than the lot sizes that would likely be within the RNP communities. So is there a reason we stopped at R1 AA?
AAA.
Sorry, at R1 AAA? We just thought it was more compatible with those smaller lot zones rather than the very largest lot zones that are almost rural.
Okay, so I'm going to ask Rebecca, unless you know the answer to this question, because or Mary or someone who, I don't have the chart in front of me. R1 AA lot widths are a minimum of?
The R1 AA is 90 feet, so the memo that we have includes all the zones that are included. I can't tell you what R1 AAA is because we took it out.
Right. I'm sorry, I need to have this in my brain, so
R1 AA is a 90-foot wide lot at the maximum and 11,000 square feet. Thank you.
Okay, and AAA is?
R1 AAA is a 100-foot wide lot, as well as R1 quadruple A, and the lot sizes are 13,000 and 20,000 square feet.
So the AA was 90, and AAA was 100.
Mm-hmm.
So a 10-foot wide difference, you feel like that is where the line should be drawn?
In general, the consultant's recommendation was actually to include all of the zones. Based on feedback from staff, we reduced that back. If there's a further recommendation from the commission to further reduce and exclude R1 AA, that would be the direction of the board.
Okay. So I'll just tell you my general sense, and I know we're not necessarily at the point of giving feedback at this point, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think that this has merit in certain places in our community, and I think in areas, I know we were trying to balance where is it appropriate versus where is it actually working as an incentive. I get that. I think there are maybe some more restrictions and maybe that's not the right word, some more opportunities to identify areas where this would be the most appropriate. I don't feel like in some of our R1 AA areas that this would be appropriate. I mean, you're cutting the lot widths potentially in half. That's pretty drastic. I don't have a problem with the concept of, the sidewalks and the trees, and if a neighborhood, I hear Mr. Dara loud and clear, I understand what they're going through in that HOA. But if people move into that neighborhood and they decide that that's what they want to do, and they know that the associated risks with it, and that's how they want to live, then I think that's fine. If they want a littler house on a littler lot, I don't want to prevent us from having a missing middle, right? I want the missing middle to not be missing anymore. I just want to make sure that it's not popping up in areas where it doesn't feel appropriate. So I'm not opposed to the concept, but I would be more interested in hearing where it would be appropriate and R1 AA coming out, perhaps.
I think Commissioner Herr, you were next.
I am. So if I go back to my notes on this from the briefing, there's a few things that I noted that just sort of bugged me from the beginning. Page 22, which is your grid, we use the word discourage, so we're discouraging a garage-forward design. I don't know what, I am discouraged from eating McDonald's and ice cream, but I do both. My wellness visit discouraged me even further, just for the record, so I got to tune that up. But I mean, either we're going to regulate it or we're not going to regulate it, but there's no, I don't know what discouraging does. So that's the first comment. I noted that 8% seems exceptionally minimal when we're trying to literally condense the housing and then say that we're creating open space, but there really isn't open space unless you're in the middle of the drainage pond. And it's not amenitized. It's just accessible. It became more accessible. It's not amenitized. So I'm not sure that actually creates the community that we think we're getting, as opposed to the illusion of a community that we think we're getting. So those two were somewhat bothersome for me. And the question that I had written down is, I just don't know why we don't like cul-de-sacs. So
I'm at.
so I get that this really looks like a city block. That's, in essence, what we're creating is subdivisions that look like city blocks. And that's okay if that's what we want, but it takes away the ability to, you know, have the family that knows they have 4 kids, that knows they can't stand to have them in the house all day, that lives on the cul-de-sac, that lets them go play in the cul-de-sac.
Go play in the street.
Go play in the street, which.
Put up a basketball.
And so it's just a whole family system that I think we've come to love, and maybe it's time that we say that's not what we're looking for anymore, but I struggle to understand why a cul-de-sac. I understood your explanation, that it creates greater traffic in the other areas. That is a problem because of the level of density that we're putting into something that we're calling single-family housing that really is so close together that it almost doesn't feel like single-family housing anymore. That's the challenge, is that we need to know what we want to be when we grow up. I too am not feeling like I love this. I love the progression of the thought, and I love that we're still thinking about it, and I love that every time we give feedback, you come back with a better solution, so that's what I'm hoping for.
Yes. Let's let Rebecca speak, and then we go to Commissioner Doyle.
And I can certainly wait for the commissioner to speak. I was just going to offer a possible suggestion for something for staff to look at in regards to this. Again, for the record, Rebecca Hammock, Development Services Director. So I believe there are some benefits to this and maybe some merit to some of the concepts that are involved. And this was an alternative to the planned development because there was some interest in maybe providing, another tool as an alternative. Because a lot of the planned developments that are coming in are requesting 50-foot wide lots or 60-foot wide lots, and a lot of those are going in areas that have larger lot sizes next to them. So it is similar to this RMP concept. But if the board is still comfortable with the planned development zoning and being able to negotiate that and it coming before the board for approval, if there's any concepts within the RMP or requirements within the RMP, we could incorporate those into the planned development section of the code instead of creating a whole new concept. So it's just an idea.
Commissioner?
Definitely not what I was asking for. I think this is really worthy work that we need to continue to pursue. I'm okay with not landing on an answer until we land on a really great answer. That's the value of the process. I personally find our current process to be more random than I like. I don't think it's good for the developers. We do feel like it's a negotiation opportunity. It's just not cool. And so there's a randomness to what's coming out the other end of the process that I don't think is good for the community. So this is really, really worthy work, and let's just keep doing it until we get it to the point where we feel really great about it. I feel much better about this than where we are and where we were. I want to feel great.
Anyone else? Commissioner Delory?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would agree with Commissioner Herr on many of her comments. I think we just do in block design. That's what I'm looking at here. It's a block, and that's not what I was anticipating. I still can't understand why we don't like cul-de-sacs. I like cul-de-sacs. I also want to make sure that we're not promoting cut-through traffic, and we need to be looking at this holistically, and also with that retention pond, the way it's shown us. Maybe we need other examples. I don't see how that's an amenity that these residents are going to be enjoying unless they're going in a boat. So I'm not ready to move forward with this, but I still think there is additional work that needs to be done. What that is, I'm hoping that we can decipher what our comments are here to try to better understand where we're going in that direction. But I just don't think this is ready for prime time today or tomorrow yet.
Commissioner Lockhart.
So I'm hearing you all loud and clear, and I agree that we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater at all. Just thinking a little bit more about the idea of where this would be most appropriate. Where are blocks most appropriate? Is this an opportunity to try to implement maybe in some of our closer to our high-intensity corridors, 1792, around our Sunrail stations, and that type of, I know some of those are in cities, but if there is an appropriate place where this can be, where we can encourage instead of discourage, I can see this really taking shape and being very appropriate and very attractive in the right place, as long as we don't have, walls around it. And I think when we try to take this type of concept and apply it into a subdivision concept, then we just have a bunch of little communities with blocks and walls around them. And so I think the word amenitized is, we're thinking of it as a much more colorful, robust amenity if this is going to be applied in a residential, oh gosh, the words are not coming to me today. If you really don't want to amenitize it, and I'm not saying you, I'm saying Mr. Developer person, if we really aren't wanting to do amenities and we just want to create blocks in certain areas, then let's just figure out how to make that work. But I feel like we're trying to convince ourselves that this is something that it really isn't in a subdivision, suburban area. Maybe this is more appropriate in a higher intensity, and I know they already get this type of density, but it's just not, it doesn't feel right yet. And I don't know.
Let me put a bow onto this, since we've all kind of tried to say the same thing. This isn't an answer for the PD. I think that's one thing, I mean, there was a point where the only negotiating was from the development side, and we weren't negotiating. Now that's a give and take that we have. I don't see this as a alternative to that. I see some positives, but like the others, I just don't know where they fit yet. And so, Rebecca, I know we're not giving you a clear answer, but we're not saying we don't like this in certain situations. It's just that we don't know what they are, and we're not comfortable with it right now. Okay?
Could I make a suggestion? It might be helpful the next time we talk about this to actually have some examples of neighborhoods that reflect this pattern, like Winter Park, and in places that you're familiar with. This is the type of development pattern that you see in Winter Park, in Baldwin Park, in Celebration, and really desirable higher end development. So I think that it might be helpful. It's hard to envision it looking at it on a flat 2-dimension. So you can maybe understand it's what you see in Chuliota or in the old part of Geneva. I mean, this is not a development pattern that's just in very, very high density areas. This grid pattern you'll see in other older neighborhoods in the county. So I think it might be helpful to really understand what this looks like and how it operates maybe in other places in Central Florida that you've all been, and you can see how stormwater ponds can be amenitized, and
thank you very much.
how
I
they
think
can
that
really
that would be helpful. I think that would
Crane's
be
Roost
helpful.
is the first one that comes to my mind, is what's an amenitized retention pond. So it may be helpful to show how these things can translate, and then if you like some of that, we can figure out how to get there.
Okay. Everybody, Commissioner Herr?
I just want to, I think that's a fantastic idea. And I think I need to fully understand every one of those areas that you just described as a city. And so if we want the whole county to become a city, then that's cool, because that seems to be where we're headed. But let's just say that.
Look, I mean, it's not, you've got a third of the county that's preserved as
I hear you,
rural,
and I
so-
hear that debate all the time, but we're talking about this being in lieu of a PD where somebody comes and asks for an exception to the current code, et cetera, And this is creating a level of density that's different from what's there now, with automatic, right through the process.
Well, your density is going to be governed by your land use designation.
Understood.
So you're going to have, there's a ceiling regardless of what you do from a development pattern. So that's always going to be governed by the underlying land use category. And those are probably things that you need to talk about when we move forward with this overall community visioning process. And I'm not pushing you to say this is good right now. My suggestion, though, is to maybe help not so much you, but maybe members of the community understand what this looks like in practice and how this is really a more traditional development pattern than what we've been seeing. So that was my only suggestion, is there are probably, people probably see this every day and don't realize it because it doesn't look like this when you're driving through it. Is my
Well,
only
and
suggestion.
I would say that I think it's for the members of the community and us as well, because we darn well need to know what we're agreeing to before we do it.
Well, and I
Just a good idea in general.
Okay, I think that we
I
can...
just didn't mean to suggest that you didn't understand.
No, I
No,
mean,
I don't
all good
understand.
points. I think that we're at a point right now that we would love to see some recommendations. We recognize we don't want to be the 8th and largest city in Seminole County, and we need to know in what occasions this may work. Okay, so with that, let's move on to the next thing, and before we do that, there's a couple of folks up here that are cold. Bob, is it all right if we turn it down a little bit?
I got a fan.
Or turn it up a little bit? I don't want to, if somebody could help us over there and turn it up a little bit, I would appreciate it very much. Okay, let's go to the Civic Assembly uses, please. You're welcome.
So moving on to assembly standards. So why are we talking about this in the first place?
Thank you, Rebecca.
The federal law limits how local jurisdictions can regulate land use with respect to religious uses. There's a law called the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act of 2000. Forgive me, I don't remember the number, and it's hidden up there, but it's from the 2000. It's not from this decade. However, this has taken some time to propagate across the country, and so many jurisdictions are still catching up with this federal law that's been on the books for over a decade. So how do jurisdictions comply with this this federal law? The best way, so these types of, and the attorney could certainly address this with more specificity on the legal side, but these are, this doesn't create standards, it creates a law that is typically, the details are worked out through case law. So based on the best recommendations from our planning organizations and the land use attorneys that are in those planning organizations, strategies for RLUIPA compliance include having very clear criteria for approval and compliance, being consistent between different religious uses and other uses that have similar impacts. So between different religions, certainly, and that is part, what the law is intended to do is protect religious exercise and prevent discrimination between different types of religious uses and between religious uses and non-religious uses. And it recommends minimizing discretionary procedures. And obviously discretionary procedures are what this board is here to do. However, some minimization of that is helpful in avoiding a legal challenge that could be associated with this federal law. As a best practice, we did look at our neighbors in the city of Orlando who did a pretty comprehensive update to their religious and assembly use standards in 2018, and they've been implementing it ever since. I've been in touch with them, and in general, the feedback I've gotten is that it's working well for them. Of course, that's a different context, and we wouldn't want to copy-paste their standards to Seminole County. As we mentioned, Seminole County is a county, and so we have made, we've relied on that to a large extent, but we've also made important modifications to the Seminole County context. So what the City of Orlando did was they created a public benefit use assembly as well as other public benefit uses, which are neutral to whether they are religious or not, and neutral to different religions, of course. And they regulate those assembly uses by size and impact rather than purely by use. Because of course, as you know, you could have, if we're talking about churches, you could have a 50-person church or a 1,000-person church, and the impacts of those on the neighboring properties would be dramatically different. So regulating by use alone isn't particularly helpful. These are the county's current definitions of assembly use, which is for places that have a space to gather 50 or more people together, as well as the current definition of church or place of worship. I put these here for reference. So the recommendation is to create a new civic assembly use. This would be limited to nonprofit uses, and you see we actually provide two options here. One is the City of Orlando option on the first bullet, which is more inclusive and includes public libraries, museums, and galleries. Now, these would all have to be nonprofit, so that is a prerequisite in every case. And by the way, the City of Orlando does not require that prerequisite that they be nonprofit, but we are proposing that to limit the possibilities here. Or a more restrictive definition, which is more specific to clubs, religious gatherings, and leaves out some of those other uses. And this would replace the place of worship use in the code. We also recommend identifying language and updating it to be more neutral where possible, either not specifying whether it's religious use or not, or making sure that it's religious rather than a specific religion. So the civic assembly use, we are recommending permitting it by right or conditionally in all zones that currently permit places of worship. In addition, in putting together, and this is part of a larger exercise we're doing of moving the land uses to table format rather than being listed independently in each zone. So when you do that, you start to notice holes where things aren't permitted where they probably should be. And in most cases, you can't get sued over a federal law over that, but in this case you can. So in this case, it's especially important to make sure that there aren't those types of gaps. So we've identified where those gaps are and recommended that these religious uses be permitted in those zones as well, whether conditionally or by right. In addition, as I mentioned, we are recommending regulating those uses by scale. So we looked at the research that City of Orlando did, and we decrease the size of the neighborhood use. So they were looking at a 200-seat assembly space, where we've reduced that to a 100-seat assembly space. And we did that based on some research. So looking at religious examples, the median U.S. church is 75 people. More than half of U.S. churchgoers, however, attend larger churches. So we have a lot of small churches, but we also have a large number of people in very large churches. And of course, that is specifically dealing with Christian churches. But it gives you a sense of how big these uses tend to be, and that there really is a market for these religious uses that are under 100 persons. In addition, there's non-religious examples such as elk and moose lodges, the Rotary clubs, and women's clubs that would also fit under this broader category of assembly uses. So the one issue that sometimes comes up when you're dealing with religious uses is accessory uses. And there are some reasonable accessory uses that need to be permitted if something is to be, if we're trying to accommodate the traditional religious assembly uses. And those include classroom spaces for taking care of children during services, for instance, office spaces for the staff, fellowship halls, and often there's one residence for a caretaker or an employee of the organization. However, there are other uses that have much greater impacts that currently have sometimes been a challenge to deal with in the code. So what we've done in that case is simply say, dealing with it as we believe would be appropriate for the federal law. If the use is allowed in the zone, it's allowed in the zone. So if daycare is allowed in the zone, it can be allowed as part of a religious use. If a school is allowed in the zone, it can be allowed as part of religious use, rather than trying to make exceptions for certain types of nonprofits. Also, and this is in your packet, there are conditions that are intended to protect residential neighborhoods and allow for the staff and the board to put in place conditions that would deal with things like noise, traffic, lighting that goes off-site, lighting after hours. So we were able to put limits around that, and in some cases, very specific limits, and in some cases, they have to be dealt with on a project-by-project basis. And one thing that we've added since we talked with you about this last is specifically a prohibition on licenses for sale of alcohol in residential neighborhoods. We know that some of these organizations do sell alcohol, and in the appropriate zone, that is perfectly fine, but that may not be permissive, that may not be appropriate if you're in a residential zone, of course. So that the reason we say sale of alcohol rather than alcohol in general is because we do know that, for instance, religious uses often host weddings. So if you're going to have a wedding, that, depending on your proclivities, that may or may not involve alcohol, and we are not, currently we're not trying to prohibit that kind of use, or a birthday party. That might even happen in a community center in a residential neighborhood. So rather than prohibiting any use of alcohol altogether, it's sale of alcohol, which is typical. The private use would be not governed by this prohibition. So a very specific question we have for you is whether you would prefer the broad or the narrow definition of civic assembly, which I mentioned on an earlier slide, and I can certainly go back to that. And of course, the broader question is whether you are comfortable with this concept in general and want us to move forward with moving these, what we've provided as bullet point standards in the memo, into code language. I'll move back to the definition slide for that reference.
Commissioner Hurd, would you like her to finish, or do you want to ask right now?
With that, I'd be happy to take questions. That's the conclusion.
All right,
That was
just
the
wanted to make sure.
conclusion.
Commissioner Hurd.
So I just want to get it on the record that this is not applicable to agritourism sites.
That's my understanding, correct.
Okay, because we get a lot of phone calls about those, so this is not that conversation. I would like to understand the advantages and disadvantages to the two definitions, because I'm not sure it's clear in my head. And generally, we need to do this to update the code to be bulletproof, so not that we're ever bulletproof, but to be more bulletproof. But I don't necessarily understand whether or not one is favorable to the other, or it's just a philosophical position. But I would like your opinion on that.
I would say it's a more philosophical position. We actually created the second definition. We thought a more limited definition might be more appropriate for Seminole County, or more appropriate as a first step. It's much easier to add uses later than to take them away under Florida laws. So the City of Orlando, the first definition is the City of Orlando's definition, which is more inclusive. And of course, we want to support things like arts and libraries, and there were great examples of neighborhood character museums that could fit under this definition. However, if the board is more comfortable with a narrow definition, then that would also address the core issue that we're here to talk about.
That was an excellent answer. I'm in favor of the definition as you guys described it.
The narrow definition.
Mr. Chairman?
Commissioner?
You hinted about something, talk about the issue. What's the issue?
Oh, the legal issue?
No, what's the issue that we're trying to address?
So there are, we do understand that there have been in Seminole County questions about religious applications that may or may not have been appropriate in specific zones. And again, I don't want to get in, per Commissioner Delari's earlier comment, I don't want to get into specific cases. But I do understand that A1 has been one of the zones that's been contentious. So the proposal, and this is in the packet, prohibits the regional size, which is the largest assembly use in the agricultural zone, whereas right now there's no specificity. The zones, essentially right now, any size religious use is allowed in the zones where it's allowed by special exception. So there isn't a process by which that gets reviewed, but it's the more guidance we can provide in the code, the more you are protected from a federally related lawsuit related to this. So to be clear in the code to say, you know what, these much larger assembly uses just aren't appropriate in these zones at all, but the smaller uses can be. Whereas in other zones, the larger uses are appropriate, so we tell you where it is appropriate to have those larger uses.
Okay. I guess I'm not seeing the direct connection to how this addresses that yet.
By providing more specific standards,
I realize that.
It reduces discretion, which could increase your vulnerability to a lawsuit. And again, I defer to the attorney on the specifics of the legal issues, but that is the best practice from our national guidance around this issue.
And then, Chairman, is it okay if I also clarify?
Please, go right ahead.
So just to clarify Eliza's point, what the code regulations are proposing, or what we're proposing, is now assembly uses, which include churches and houses of worship, would be separated into 3 different categories. We'd have community, neighborhood, and regional. And so then the larger of an assembly use facility is now only permitted within certain zoning categories with conditions. They're not, the assembly use isn't, or the church isn't an outright permitted use regardless of its size and impact. So we're limiting or putting conditions on the use to make sure that they are appropriate for certain locations.
Okay, Commissioner Lockhart, Commissioner Delory, I'll go back to you.
Now, let me think about this, because I'm still having issues with it.
Can I help?
Go right ahead.
Okay. So in some situations, you have very large churches, mega churches, and currently the way it is, and you're to correct me if I'm saying this wrong, I'm just going to try and say it differently. They could, by right of just being a church, regardless of their size and impact of traffic, they could go into a very rural area and create a lot of movement in that neighborhood. And so now, and we wouldn't want to say no necessarily, because then they could say, well, you just said no because we're a church, and we don't like that, and we could be sued. So now we're saying it doesn't matter whether you're a religious use or whatever type of non-religious assembly use, it's about the size, not about what goes on inside the building. Is that correct?
Right. So it would be more content neutral. We're not basing it on the particular religion or whatever's going on at that assembly. It's more so based on the size. So. Impact, correct.
And let me also add, most of the residential zones in Seminole County also allow religious uses or places of worship by special exception today. So whether it's a mega church or a 50-seat, synagogue, the board has to make that decision with very little guidance on appropriateness from the code.
Okay. Does anybody have any further concerns about this? Is it okay to start moving forward with this? Go ahead, Commissioner.
Well, I wanted to further explore Commissioner Herr's question about the narrow versus broader definition. Folks are incredibly creative, and I love that about people, but I could see any one of these other uses in the broader category, someone being able to somehow finagle. Well, we're a recreation center that has a lot of art on the walls, and now we're a museum. So, you can call it whatever you want to call it. I think the folks in our community that want to participate in any of these activities that are to be encouraged and civic-minded, I'm not sure why we would want to prohibit a nonprofit museum or I'm not sure that there's a benefit to narrowing it, except it will just make people have to be more creative to do what it is that they want to do. I don't know if, are we going to be going in and investigating whether or not it's they're having performing arts, like we had the Tajiri School of the Arts here in downtown Sanford for a while, and that was, it's wonderful arts. It wasn't a recreation center or a meeting hall, it was a performing arts center, but I wouldn't have ever wanted to tell them that they wouldn't have fit this category if it was appropriate. So I don't want to be so restrictive that we then turn people into liars. And sometimes I think we do that.
Commissioner Delory?
I'm getting back to the fact that I'm having an issue because now we're doing this with schools as well, correct? Schools would fall into this category.
Schools would not fall into this. City of Orlando does include schools within this category. We have not recommended that. What we did say is that in some cases, sometimes churches run schools, and those would be allowed if schools are allowed in that zone. So this doesn't specifically regulate schools.
Because I'm looking at where it says civic assembly usage, and it says neighborhood, community, regional. I'm going by the numbers. There's a lot of schools, more than 500 seats.
And schools are regulated separately, so this would not address schools.
Okay.
I just don't know which one I like better.
All right.
Well, and can I add one thing on that?
Yes, you want to try some clarity here?
So I will say that we created these two definitions before we put in the alcohol prohibition. So one of the creative things that we've seen in the past is bars that are also art galleries that are qualifying as art galleries rather than bars. Because we've added the alcohol prohibition in certain areas, that may cover the issue of at least one of those creative exemptions that you wouldn't necessarily want to allow, for instance, in residential areas. So we do have that safeguard. We also have the safeguard that it's not for profit. So there's a number of safeguards that are here that I think we could go with the broader definition and it would be okay. But again, I did want to provide that option, both options.
Well, and I feel like I need to clarify, I'm on the second one. Let's not use broader or narrower because again, we don't all speak the same. But
Okay.
I think the fewer delineated items you can add, but you can't take away is where you had me. That taking away is difficult, adding is not as difficult. Starting somewhere is better than thinking we know what we're doing from the get-go. Walk before we run. I thought that was the wisest consult of the day.
So I guess, and I don't disagree with that, except that I can see someone utilizing one of these facilities for a very good and valid purpose, but then they're essentially now violating our code, and now they're up for a code enforcement situation, if you can get code enforcement to respond. And then I've seen people sell cups and you get the drink for free. There's always somebody that figures out some way to get around the rule.
God bless America.
God bless America. So I just, I would hope that we would still continue to be mindful that even if we choose the second option, that keeping our minds open to the fact that there could be other appropriate uses that would fall into the first definition, that we wouldn't necessarily want to prohibit them. I don't know.
Well,
Rebecca, go ahead.
And for the record, Rebecca Hammack, Development Services Director. The other thing that you might want to consider is that with the first definition of civic assembly that includes more permitted or more uses, the civic assembly is in all the residential districts are special exception uses. They would have to have special exception approval, so that would help. It wouldn't be an outright permitted use, so if there's a particular use there that you may have concerns about, it's not going to just be permitted outright. It would have to be appropriate for that location and meet the special exception criteria.
Can we move, is there consensus then to move on and to go with the recommendation? Okay, thank you very much. That's what we're going to do. Now we're going to the next item is by the way, is there any, we've already gone through comments, but is there any comments on this particular issue?
James, you have anything in cyber on this one, the civic assembly uses?
No, sir.
Thank you very much. We're now going to go into the truck and recreational vehicle parking in residential areas, and this is done by staff. So Rebecca?
This one should be interesting.
Thank you. Good morning again. For the record, Rebecca Hammock, Development Services Director. Staff has a few items related to parking in residential areas that we wanted to cover with the board. The first item is in regard to Section 30.1350 in the Land Development Code, which prohibits truck parking within residentially zoned areas. So our current definition prohibits parking or storing of trucks of more than 2 tons or having more than 2 axles in residential areas. It's come to our attention from code enforcement that this is difficult to enforce and is somewhat outdated due to the newer, larger trucks that are being used for personal use, like F-150s. So we are going to look at other jurisdictions and see how they regulate truck parking and commercial truck parking in residential areas, and come back to you with some code language ideas. We have looked at some other jurisdictions, and we do think there's definitely some ideas that we can glean from their codes, which we will bring back to you. The next issue that has come to our attention in discussions about the new legislation related to House Bill 403, which is the home-based businesses. So the new legislation does allow the jurisdictions to regulate parking as well as truck parking and commercial parking on properties that have a home-based business. Currently, our code does not regulate the location of parking on an individual lot. We do require a minimum of 2 parking spaces for a residential unit. However, there's no provision within the code that says where you have to park on your property. So we wanted to see if there was any interest from the board related to the location of parking on a residential lot, which may help enforce the regulations within the statutes related to House Bill 403, so that you don't have a number of people coming to the property and parking all over the front yard, for example. Some codes and other jurisdictions do require that you cannot park basically on your front yard unless you're parked on a driveway. The other issue is similar, but is related to recreational vehicles. And this is not a widespread issue. I have consulted with code enforcement. They do get a handful of complaints, but it appears to be isolated. But I know the commission has received some complaints from various communities. So I wanted to bring the topic up, at least for discussion. And that's related to the fact that the code does not have any restrictions or regulations related to parking of boats, recreational vehicles, jet skis. As long as they're parked on your private property, we do not limit, our code does not limit the number or location of where they can be parked. Granted, most subdivisions with homeowners associations do regulate that, but we do have some older neighborhoods within the county that do not have homeowners associations. So those are the 3 issues that we wanted to bring to your attention. Staff is not making any recommendations at this point, other than we would like to come back with some code language related to the truck parking to help clarify that and to help code enforcement be able to enforce that requirement.
Okay. Comments? Commissioner?
I certainly don't have a problem with you bringing back some language on the truck parking situation. Some of these older neighborhoods that are not HOAs are in my district. Commissioner Constantine and I share one of them. And Rebecca, you and some staff members were gracious enough to participate in a Zoom meeting with me with some of the neighbors. One of the benefits that some people find in selecting an unincorporated neighborhood without an HOA is that they don't have these kinds of restrictions. When you choose to buy a home in that neighborhood, people are typically pretty excited about, yay, there's no HOA, and everyone in the neighborhood agrees with that, and everybody kind of plays nicely until someone moves in the neighborhood and they decide they don't like it, and they want everybody else to change. So I've had conversations with some of these folks who are their aesthetics are not, they're not liking the aesthetics of some neighbors and some different toys that are out in the front yard. And so my suggestion was, well, have you asked them if they would just please mind parking them in the backyard? And, oh, no, I'm not going to ask them to do that. So until and unless we have neighborhoods that are willing to have conversations with one another, I am not comfortable with making a blanket new code for an entire county because some neighbors don't want to talk to each other. If we get to the place where there are some really good conversations and I'm happy to be a part of the conversation, but I'm not going to be the teacher that makes the whole class stay in from recess because one kid wouldn't stop talking. So that's where I'm at on that.
Anybody else? Commissioner?
Mr. Chairman, I will agree with Commissioner Lockhart, and I'm not going to get into any more details than she phrased it perfectly.
Commissioner Hurd?
So I want to be a little bit more specific. So I think what you were addressing was the toys in the yard, so RVs, jet skis, et cetera, so the last bullet point.
Correct.
And I think you addressed the first bullet point of bring back the truck thing. How about the number of vehicles? Is that a different discussion? And can they be parked all over the front yard? And the reason I bring that up, I think it's a little bit of a different discussion. We're moving to a different type of workplace. COVID has created a dynamic where we are now, every single home is open for business. And we're not doing meetings in the conference rooms of our businesses anymore because the businesses are prohibiting it. But we're doing meetings in living rooms. And, we're running car shops out of houses in my very own neighborhood. So I think that one is a little bit of a different discussion because the world has changed.
Commissioner, can I just, and let me just say, to piggyback on you, with the new laws that we have in Tallahassee also prohibiting local government from allowing businesses in homes, and I still don't know if we really have a clear definition of that yet. But what if a guy opens up an auto repair shop in his garage and he's got 6 or 7 cars out there, in that? Well, I mean.
In Heathrow.
In Heathrow, okay. Wherever it is, but okay.
They've got an HOA.
And, okay, but I'm just saying, I mean, I agree that I don't want to get into the personal, individual situations, but, we've got to contend with potentially this. Yes, Commissioner.
Mr. Chairman, I believe we already have a mechanism. It's called an occupational license. If they don't have an occupational license, they can't have a business in their home, unless I'm missing something. If we're not enforcing that, then that's a different issue.
So we do have a business tax receipt requirement, which is through the tax collector. And so they would be the enforcement arm if somebody is actually running a business without having paid their business tax receipt, or if they have a business that is regulated and requires a state license. They do encourage on the application that they check with zoning first to make sure it's a permitted use, and that they're allowed to have that. But the business tax receipt now, it's a tax. They've replaced the occupational license is now a business tax receipt.
And does not have any requirements per se.
Correct, other than the county does regulated or non-regulated, and if you're regulated, you're required to have a state license.
Yeah, so all you do with the offender is they go get the license.
Yeah, so we're back to where the question that basically we have, how do we control that? Or do we control that? Commissioner Lockhart.
So, and that's funny, I wasn't even thinking about it from the perspective of a home being used as a business and cars being parked. I was thinking about my neighbor with 6 kids, and now they're all driving, and every one of them has a car. And and the garage isn't filled with cars, it's filled with stuff, because you got 6 kids. And so, where they can't all park in the driveway, and we certainly don't want them parking in the street, and so there's a part of the yard, in the side yard, that is now, it's gravel and grass, and that's where we're parking, so that we don't have to do the game of musical chairs in the morning for everyone to get out of the car. Like, I watch it happen, right? So I see this go down. So I don't want to put a burden on families who specifically bought a home in a non-HOA, unincorporated Seminole County area, and now all of a sudden, they might as well have bought a house in Heathrow because we're cranking at them about how many cars they have and where they're parked. I don't feel comfortable with it personally. I think if people want to live that way, we have plenty of communities in this county that they can go buy in. That's my 2 cents. You can outvote
I
me
think
for sure.
what the state did not think about is the unintended consequences. And what you've just said is wonderful until their next door neighbor wants to sell their house. And somebody has a auto repair shop next door. And then you're going to hear a lot of people concerned. Did you want to say something, Rebecca?
No, I'm sorry. There are provisions within the Florida statutes that we can enforce as long as there's provisions within our code to regulate those. And one of those is, changing the character of the residential neighborhood. So if, someone, for instance, is doing auto repair at their home and they've got, multiple cars parked all over, I think that we could make an argument that that has changed the residential character of the area.
But do we have that in the code today?
We do, and in our definition for home-based businesses and home offices.
So if I'm reading the tea leaves correctly, the commission does not want to change the provisions currently that are in there. Okay. All right. So that gives you the direction, but we also want you to be looking out for unintended consequences.
Yes.
And bringing them back bring back ideas if you see something that's starting to become a problem.
Sure, absolutely. So I'll come back with the truck parking, but for the residential parking and the recreational vehicle parking, those will, we will not be making any changes for those.
I think that's the flavor of the commission.
Sounds great. Thank you very much.
Okay, before we end that, though, is there anybody here that wishes to speak on that? Any public comment? Joseph, any public comment?
Joseph or James?
I'm sorry, James, please forgive me. Yeah, all of a sudden I just said, James, Joseph, I'm thinking of the apostles. James, anything?
No, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. All right,
Chairman?
Yes.
There's one thing that did not get addressed in all of this that is happening in my district, and this is the notion of a garage that's 5 times the size of the dwelling and disconnected from the dwelling and doesn't look anything like the dwelling. And so I do think we need to take that as a takeaway for future adjustments in terms of what we can do about that phenomena. Because right now, there's nothing we can do about it, as I understand from Nicole and the team. And it just simply, it doesn't make sense to the neighbors, it doesn't make sense to the surrounding area. And so I feel as though it was a loophole that was jumped through. Perhaps it's not. I understand that there are property rights, and I am pro-property right, but the neighbors have property rights too. And so it's the strangest thing I've ever seen. And I can't defend it when I take the phone calls in my office.
So, and what Commissioner Herr is describing is that there is no criteria in our land development code with respect to the size of an accessory structure in relation to a primary structure. So you could have a garage that's bigger than a house.
5 times.
The primary use. And of course, and we don't have residential architectural standards either. And I think
Accessory dwelling.
for dwelling units we do, but not for things like sheds or garages or other structures. So, and a lot of places do. That's not an uncommon regulation to have, is to have typically you'll see them as the accessory structure can only be a certain percentage size of the primary structure, which is what you do have, as Commissioner Lockhart, I think, was mentioning. We do have that provision for accessory dwelling units. We have one zoning district in which those are allowed, but they can only be, I think it's 30 or 35% the size of the primary structure. So that may be something that you want us to take a look at as we're reviewing the land development code.
I think that you have a consensus that we would like you to take a look at that. One other thing that I wanted to bring up is something that I think Commissioner Herr, I saw some back and forth discussion with you. I've seen some back and forth noise in the county about it, and that is some of, again, in relation to trees, cutting them down. Since we've got a few minutes, I just wanted to see, Rebecca, is there anything new on that you could report, please?
For the record, Rebecca Hammock, Development Services Director. At a previous work session, we did bring proposed language to the board to include within the subdivision regulations to require that 25% of the existing trees remain on site to help with that issue with clear-cutting lots. We have heard some feedback that can be difficult because of stormwater requirements for drainage. So we're going to look at other provisions about maybe you have to reserve a certain area with 25% trees. We're going to look at best practices and see what we think would be most beneficial.
Because I think that the point in question that was in Commissioner Herr's district was said that they were going to do everything they could to preserve the trees, and then, all the trees are gone the next day. So, I'm just tired of it. I'm tired of the clear cutting. I've said this before. I hope the other commissioners, agree with me. But the point is that we've got to do something about that. That, one day, come in, yes, we're going to try to preserve, and then, we can't do it because of, the drainage or whatever the case may be, and they, the land is stripped, and it's like a open canvas to paint whatever they want to paint. Commissioner Herr?
Well, and what I'm finding, I'm learning all sorts of new things. Number one, the trees that they attempted to preserve were in the way of the power company. So after they do attempt to preserve them, and it was minimal, I'm not defending any of it, but now the power company can come in and say, well, that's right in the way of the line, and oops, we can't do anything about it. But yet, if I go out to a site visit and say, we got to get back to the power company, is there not another route? Oh, well, there may be another route. Well, unless we're standing out there, the other route isn't found. And that is just somewhat disturbing. But the other thing that I'm finding is that I actually think we do have rules that say things that are different from what is happening. And I think we actually need to get back to the core value of the code and make sure that we are at least making folks adhere to what we have. And if what we have is not good enough, then we need to fix what we have. But right now, it does just seem like the wild, wild west to me.
Yes.
And I live in a very regulated industry and understand regulation, and what I'm seeing and what I'm feeling are two entirely different things. And my heart goes out to staff trying to figure out how to do this. Because in all honesty, I get the sense that staff is trying to make us happy. And that's created a dynamic that is just troublesome. So we got to fix this. I am on board. Let's fix it.
Commissioner?
I'd like to know, when we hear the feedback that, well, I couldn't preserve because XYZ, is the XYZ because of a requirement that we have placed on them? And so are we asking them to preserve, but on the other hand saying, but you must do this, and then therefore they're developers are being given two things that they cannot comply with. So do we need, I think I just need to hear from you all, what are we doing that is keeping them from being able to do what we want them to do? If that is the case. If that's not the case, and it's that we need to hire more people to be out there to have eyes on scene to make sure bulldozers aren't going where bulldozers shouldn't go, then tell us that too. If it's a manpower issue because we need to have someone out there in an orange vest the whole time, that's fine. But we just need to know what we need to do to help what we think we're trying to do happen.
So the main feedback that we're hearing from the development community, and John may be able to better explain from an engineering perspective, is that the stormwater requirements that are now required that are more stringent than in the past. And so a lot of times and this is, I mean, and I can't, verify the validity of this, but this is what we're being told, is that because they have to create a certain drainage flow on the site, it does require a lot of clearing and grading and sometimes filling, and it's very difficult to save trees in that environment. So that's why staff was thinking, I was thinking that maybe we need to look at, if you have a tree preservation requirement, maybe it has to be within a certain area of the site, and then that way you just don't touch that area, and so then that way those two requirements are not coming in conflict. I think there's ways to do it. It's more expensive, and I think that tends to be the issue. Because our code, like Commissioner Hurd did say, our code does currently say to work with the natural topography of the land. But of course, that's difficult to do, and also meet your stormwater requirements.
Right.
So the stormwater requirements, though, are typically a function of how much development you're putting on the site.
Bingo.
So it's to meet the stormwater requirements, it's really driven by the amount of development they're trying to accomplish on the site. They're not necessarily onerous so much as they are folks trying to maximize their sites. So the more development
We
you bring on
need
a
to
site-
find the balance.
So,
And the fact of the matter, I'm sorry. go ahead.
And I would just say, so I think, my suggestion to the board would be, pick a threshold. Tell them you have to meet, I don't know if it's 25%, I don't know what I don't know what the number is. Pick a number and then make them work around that. So they know I have to meet 10%, 15%, whatever preservation. That means I can't put 100 units, I can only put 80 units to meet all of the other requirements associated with. I mean, that's what it gets down to. Because I think if you have them do it the other way and try to preserve the landscaping around what they're trying to do out there, it seems to be the landscaping is what suffers and what is sacrificed. So if you start that threshold up here, when you get this piece of property, I'm going to have to preserve 10, 15, 25, whatever the number is. They work around that.
Commissioner Delory.
Thank you. Rebecca, are you aware that through federal ordinance changes that the power companies are changing their transmission voltage, and then has a trickle-down effect on what can be done with the property around it and/or clear cut and/or vegetation that's allowed to be planted? That actually is in place. It's actually happening now. And Duke is actually going through and doing a lot more clear cutting than we normally would have done. Are you familiar with any of that?
So I'm not familiar with the specifics of the requirements, but I have heard anecdotally that Duke is doing a lot of tree trimming and clearing.
And the reason being is because they were allowed to change the voltage on their transmission, on their transmission lines.
To higher voltage, and therefore...
Which causes other issues too, which we haven't even discussed yet. And I would love to get information, since we're asking for it, what that actually would happen to the surrounding residents, because they're not aware of it.
I mean, we could sit up here all day and try to figure out what's the right, but I guess what I'm asking for is to reach out to the staff. What our concern is. I mean, it's the clear cutting, and it's continually happening. So we understand the topography, we understand the drainage, we understand the percentage, the trees, we understand all this. What we're asking for is, from the staff's perspective, that can be regulated. Help us find an answer.
Absolutely. I mean, currently, at minimum, what we're proposing is to retain 25% of the existing trees on site, similar to the site plan regulations, but we'll research additional regulations that we can bring to you for consideration. Again, one of the other things that was brought to our attention is a lot of times the trees on site may not be in good condition. So,
And that's another argument that we've heard, every time a tree's leaf falls, okay, that tree is diseased, let's cut it down. The bottom line is what we see. And what we see is, empty lots. And it seems to occur time and time again. And that's what we want to avoid.
Okay.
Is everybody agreed on that?
I am agreed, although I will add that the percentage alone, I just don't think it gets us there.
Yeah.
Because, so I appreciate the concept, but the percentage alone doesn't get us there. It also has to contain rules around buffers and all of the rest of it, or
Legacy
it's still going to be
trees.
the
Yeah.
same.
So look at, that isn't the solution, but I think it's too simplistic, is what you're saying. I agree. Let's find.
I agree. It's just one of the tools
Correct.
that
Right.
need, in a group of tools
It
that we
could be
need.
the
Yeah.
fallback position. It
And
could be.
I will tell you, one of the challenges, and I think we all know the particular situation that we're talking about now, is it's in PDs, frequently those things get waived. And even if there is a standard
goes the
frequently in a
PDs
PD, that regulation and that baseline gets jostled down. And
Okay.
it will take fortitude on the part of the board, is what I'm saying, is that it's not, we can enumerate everything out, and unless you say, we're not, these are things that can't be changed in a PD, or, so it is, to Commissioner Herr's point, bigger than just a percentage.
Well-
And there are a lot of factors, and
We're looking for ideas, and we don't want these ideas to happen after 3 or 4 more properties get, clear cut. We want to find an answer and a solution soon. Or not a solution, but an answer. So we appreciate it. Okay, folks, it's 5 till 12. We've covered everything in the work session. Is there anything else, County Manager, that we need to discuss right now before we do a recess until 1:30?
staff doesn't have anything for this morning.
Anybody else for the good of the order out there that needs to say anything before we recess until 1:30? Okay, everybody have a wonderful lunch. We'll see you all back here at 1:30. Thank you very much.